Hi everyone, this is Evan Langer with the Langer Commercial Group. Usually in my leasing modules, I'll go over a clause that's in most landlord lease forms. I'll talk about why a landlord might want that clause in the lease, why a tenant might not want that clause in the lease, and then most often I'll go into one or two ways that the parties normally successfully negotiate those clauses. Today I want to take a bit of a different approach. Obviously, it's very important what's in your lease. However, it's also very important what's not in your lease. If you go over a landlord's lease form, the vast majority of the time, there are several things that you would want in there as a tenant, and those things are not in there. So there actually are a lot of those, but I've got three off the top of my head that I want to cover today. The first one is a landlord default. If you look at your lease form, you'll see that there could be anywhere from a half of a legal page up to sometimes three legal pages that cover all the nuances of a tenant's default. What constitutes a tenant's default? How much and what type of notice does a landlord have to give the tenant if it's in default? What methodologies can a landlord take to pursue a tenant if the tenant's in default? What are the different types of damages that a landlord can collect if the tenant's in default? All of these things are covered in great detail, so clearly default is a very important section for a landlord. Now, when we're done looking at the tenant default section, I challenge you to search your lease for a landlord default section. In my opinion, 75 to 80% of the time or more, there's not even a single sentence in a landlord's lease form that says that a landlord could conceivably be in default. Now, courts will usually go toward the tenant and fashion a way and say, of course, a landlord can be in default. However, you're really kind of behind the eight ball if you don't have anything in your lease that describes what constitutes a landlord's default. If there aren't any remedies stated there, then the court would have to say, okay, you can use this remedy and find a justification for that. And so you really want to have a landlord's default section as broad as you could possibly get in the lease. The next item that is typically not in a landlord's lease form is a tenant's right to audit. So I'm thinking of a situation that arose last week. I got a call from a client. I had negotiated his lease a couple of years ago. He was in an office building. So he had a base year lease. And if you want to refer to my prior module on different types of leases for what a base year lease is, you can do that. But suffice it to say, in the first year under a base year lease, he didn't have to pay any costs other than his base rent. No taxes, no insurance, no maintenance, none of those obligations. The second year under a base year lease, you have to pay your portion, your proportion. If you're 10% of the building, you pay 10% of those increases in those costs for your building. So he got a bill. Normally you can expect or would expect that these expenses would rise from year to year in a building and 3%, maybe 4, maybe 5. Nothing's linear, but these are the normal expectations. Well, at the end of the second year, he was surprised to get a bill for the expenses, and they had increased by 21% over the prior year. So he was very upset, and in his lease, he actually had a landlord audit form because I negotiated, a tenant's right to audit because I had negotiated that for him. However, in most leases, they're not there, and if you don't negotiate it, then it's not there. And then landlords don't have to let you see their books and records. They don't typically even have to provide an explanation for you. And in this case, we went to the landlord and said, this is way high and we need to see why. Well, the landlord sent out a list of its expenses, but they were in very broad form in very big categories. So you couldn't tell from what they sent why the cost had gone up so much. And the verbal explanation that we were given was pretty poor. So the next step, and we're still in the process, would be, and I think we're going to get the answers that we need without any trouble, but the next step would be to send the landlord a notice that says, we're hereby coming in to audit your books and records on the operating expenses and the taxes and the lease. So you want this in your lease if you're a tenant. If you get a bill and it seems ridiculous, and perhaps you have a suspicion that the landlord is putting costs in there that don't belong, In the past, more in the 80s and 90s than now, but it still comes up. People are finding out that landlords were expensing company cruises and company Christmas and holiday parties and picnics and other things along that line and charging the tenants for those things. And no tenant that I know likes that. If you'll excuse me for 1 second, just to look at my notes. Yes. The third topic is landlord's insurance. If you look at the tenant's insurance portion of your lease, you'll see that it goes into great detail. What types of coverages are tenants required to maintain? What are the amounts? What are the deductibles? Who has to be named as an additional insured on the tenant's policies? What are the requirements, both AM Best ratings and otherwise, of the companies that a tenant is allowed to use even to get those policies of insurance? All that is in there in the insurance clause and more. So again, as with a default clause, I challenge you afterwards to look at your lease and see whether there is even a clause in the lease requiring a landlord to maintain insurance. Obviously, as a tenant, you want the landlord to have fire and extended coverage insurance. What if the building burns down? You want it to be built back up. Also, what if there's a slip and fall? Somebody gets hurt or killed in the parking lot and it's the landlord's fault. They need to have commercial general liability to cover that. They may not have the financial wherewithal to pull that kind of money out of their pocket. They may have had it when the lease was signed. They may not have it now, or they may have sold the property to somebody that doesn't have that kind of financial wherewithal. So this is another clause that you really want to see in your lease as a tenant that's not in there. So again, yes, look at your lease or have your professional, better yet, your attorney and or your broker, look at the various business and legal parameters of your lease. Make sure that's what's in there, that what's in there covers what you need. But also, somebody with the knowledge to do so needs to look at your lease and look at all the things that are not in there, because they can hurt you just as badly as the things that are in there. Again, this is Evan Langert with the Langert Commercial Group. I remind you that nothing in this or any of my other modules is intended to give specific brokerage or legal advice to anybody. Every situation is different, and if you want to talk about your situation specifically, please contact me. I'm at 443-529-0505. Again, 443-529-0505. My email is elangert@thelangertgroup.com. That's elangert@thelangertgroup.com. Elangert is E-L-A-N as in Nathan, G-E-R-T as in Thomas. As always, have a great day and God bless.